Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session in the Decision Makers track. In this particular session, we're going to be looking at leveraging API observability to meet product objectives. Apologies for a couple of minutes delay, but we are here. We are excited to present yet another aspect of observability, specifically for decision makers, that's going to bring a whole lot of value from the product objectives perspective, taking a slightly higher view of things. So I'm going to hand it over to Derric, who's going to give us a little bit of an introduction and then head on over to the discussion for today. So over to you, Derric.
Thanks a lot, Buddha. Super happy to be here and talking about how do we apply observability, especially for product management and business folks. So just a quick overview of myself. I'm the CEO of MOSA. We're the leading API analytics and monetization platform. As we love working with different API-first businesses around PLG, trying to drive developer adoption and different usage-based pricing models for APIs. And if you're ever in San Francisco, just let me know. My email's right here. You can find me at the local bar drinking some IPAs. Awesome. So why are we talking about observability for APIs in particular? What we've noticed is this trend towards SaaS to APIs. And so what used to be done through manual tasks and done through various UIs can now be done through automation. And a lot of the value is now being delivered through APIs. I'm going to be speaking a lot on how do you actually measure that value through your APIs throughout the rest of this presentation. And when we think about observability, these are probably some of the things that come to mind. Different infrastructure metrics, how do you track the health of your infrastructure, your APIs, your servers, and the like, tracking things like memory usage, performance, latency, and so on. But of course, these are great for tracking engineering concerns. But what happens when you care about and need to focus on what does the customer get out of your platform? What is the value that they're getting out of it? And so one thing to keep in mind is that your infrastructure metrics don't necessarily equal the customer value. So here we listed out just a couple different example companies. And so if you look at Cinch or Twilio, a lot of times they're selling on SMS volume. How many text messages are being sent? Was it delivery time for those text messages? For something like Stripe, it's about revenue, right? Their main focus is to help their customers drive more revenue by integrating with their payments APIs. For Datadog, they're charging on data volume, but there's a little bit of a two-way street here, right? Because you want to increase the data volume, but I should actually maybe even tweak this to be quality of data. How do we make sure we're sending the right data to the platform to get the right insights out of it? Same thing with Segment, tracking number of unique users. Their main goal is to help you drive more user growth and adoption through by using tools like Segment. And so throughout this presentation, we focus on these three key areas from a product standpoint: adoption, engagement, and retention. Let's first focus on just adoption itself. And one thing we've noticed is the shift in how developers are adopting APIs and developer platforms. What used to be done in 2003 as fully large rollouts throughout the entire enterprise and on-prem instance, we then shifted to 2013, where we had a lot of different companies purchasing SaaS platforms. I like to call it a team purchase, right? A team of 5 or 10 people can adopt something like Asana or Jira and use it for the team, even though other teams at the organization might be using different pieces of software. But let's fast forward to 2023, where really it's a single developer has the authority to choose which API they want to integrate with. Is it Algolia for search? Is it Auth0 for authentication? There's a lot of different platforms out there. And so it's no longer just about the team decision. It's about what an individual developer who's tasked to go solve a business problem, what do they like to use? And are they actually successful with it? But they're going to have a lot of other issues they run into: legal and security, project priorities, finance, and the like. So how do you make sure they can actually get to adopting your APIs as quick as possible without these other things in the way? Well, that's where we introduced the whole idea of developer first or self-service, where instead of having a lot of the procurement cycles, you can have click-through terms of service, a very fast integration process, and just getting up and running on a manager's credit card. And so what you're trying to do is really widen your funnel to get as many customers or many developers just trying out the API. And you're trying to get them to pay even a token amount as quick as possible. So that token amount might be just $100 a month, something very simple, just for them to start testing things out and building a simple POC or MVP. But how do you start measuring these type of things when we're looking at things like adoption? What we can start looking at is these different metrics like time to first hello world and time to first working app. These are two key metrics, especially when we look at the adoption of different APIs. And what I'm laying out here is really two different pieces of an adoption funnel. The first half here, which is in blue, are things that are happening before the developer is using the API. They're visiting your doc pages, they're signing up potentially for the service, they're requesting a demo, they're doing things that are usually within the UI itself. But then we have what we call the first hello world. And in this case, we're showing that about 30% of developers got to that step. And what is hello world in this case? It may mean just sending a simple API call through Postman, downloading a Postman collection, using curl or whatever it is that they're using. They're not even really building a full app yet. They're just exploring the API to see will it solve their use case. Of course, there's going to be a big drop off where they can't even get past the documentation. There's documentation issues. There's issues with the guides and tutorials, and they're just not able to even realize that there's a use case that's solvable here. And then we're going to get a percentage of those developers that move to this next step, which is working app. And there's different terms for this. You can call it first paid app, first working app, time to revenue. But it's really the time it takes for a developer to build what we call like a POC or MVP. And it's something they can show to their manager. It's something they can show to their other team members, or maybe to potential users or customers, especially if it's an external facing API. But it's that time it takes to build at least something that they can show and really demo to other people. And so again, the first half here is mostly focused on what's happening within the website itself. The second half is focused on what's happening within the API. And so this is a quick way we can actually demonstrate how do you actually measure something like your adoption funnel. Going from sign up to the first hello world, we're seeing how long does it take and the percentage to get to that very first single API call. In this case, we're seeing how many people made at least one API call to the payments API. But when we get to the working app, it may be over 100 API calls. A good example of that is maybe it takes over 100 text messages being sent through the API to see something that it's more of an automated or full working application versus just something sent through Postman. This is a quick overview of adoption, but let's dig into the engagement side. And going back to what I mentioned around infrastructure metrics, we need to ensure that these type of metrics are aligned to customer value. And this is very industry dependent and business dependent. So for example, if you're an e-commerce platform, it may mean looking at things like checkout conversion rate. If you're a SaaS platform, it may mean looking at things like how many different integrations are being used, how many different extensions. We see a lot within the data and AI space. What is the match rate? Was it found in a database? Because if you have a bunch of customers, they're using your API, but only 5% of the queries return anything, that might be a bad experience. It means, is it a bad query itself? Is it because your data set is invalid or just not to par to what they're looking for? Similarly for logistics, looking at things like successful order fulfillments. How long does it take to fulfill that order? And so when we look at it from a business standpoint, we're going to define SOAs as well, but those SOAs are not necessarily uptime. Instead, going to the logistics case, it might mean how long does it take for that order to be fulfilled? For the data API, it means what percentage of queries are actually found. Now, a key thing here, though, is we need to break down what is it a self-service user seeing versus what the next layer of enterprise sales will see, right? And so when we look at users on self-service, we talk about them paying a token amount, $50 a month, $100 a month. That's not necessarily the end game, right? And so what we're looking at here is really a couple of different things. One, finding customers that have specific enterprise requirements. This could be compliance, this could be other things. More importantly, expanding usage, right? So that developer that signed up, paying $100 a month, a lot of times they were only signing up for that plan just to get started. right? But they might have much higher expectations for what that volume looks like once you get to more of a production level environment. Similarly, adopting additional APIs, right? So that developer might have started with just using the SMS API, but if you're a telco company and you have voice and data and video, there's maybe a lot of other use cases that can actually be applicable for that same developer. And so what we get here is actually this flywheel. We call it the PLG sales flywheel. And again, I'm breaking this out into two pieces. The first piece here, the orange part, is focused on that developer journey. Self-service developers and users who get up and running, they see the aha moment, and they start increasing their usage. And so that activation funnel I showed earlier around time to first hello world and time to working app is really focused on these orange steps, right? How do we help a developer, an individual developer, start using the platform and start seeing value? Because as soon as they see value, then they're going to start showing their manager, it solves their use case, and they're going to continue to dig in further, right? And we can start looking at indicators of when does that happen, right? And there's a couple of different indicators, one being increase in usage, right? We showed earlier, we could see that we could go from 1 API call to 100 API calls, but how do we see a person go from 100 API calls to 1,000 API calls or 10,000 and more? And that actually gives your sales team, your CS team, and other folks at the organization to identify those users that are now increasing their usage, maybe to 100% week over week or 1,000% week over week, to then engage with them to make sure, are we solving the problem the right way? And also identify new use cases, because they may be only using 5% of all the APIs you have available. We like to talk about APIs as building blocks or like Legos. But if they're only using one of those Legos, how do we make sure they can see all the other capabilities that you might have? And by doing so, they're going to accelerate their usage further, which then fuels this flywheel that we're showing here. And so one way to do that is you can actually start scoring your accounts red, yellow, green. This has been done for many years, especially in the CS industry for SaaS. But now when we start looking at it from an API perspective, it's not necessarily just who the customer is, but also looking at what are they doing with the APIs? What is the volume of transactions that they have? Who are they in terms of customer or industry? Are they adding new seats? Are they adding new integrations, new APIs that they're using? What are they using in terms of the platform? Are they growing, right? And this allows you to start identifying those different types of accounts. But one thing to keep in mind is not all traffic is good. And the example I like to talk about is your customers are not purchasing requests per second. Just by seeing a customer spikes from a very small amount to suddenly millions of requests per second doesn't mean they're getting value out of it. In fact, a lot of times we want to encourage developers to use a batch endpoint of some sort to be more performant. Let's say you're a text messaging platform. You can send a single text message through the API. You can send maybe 100 text messages as a batch through the API. So how do you measure that in the right way and not just look at API calls by themselves? An example here, not every query will return item in this case. It could be out of stock, it could be unavailable. So we actually want to have some weighting applied to say, well, the stuff that's available is higher weight than stuff that is out of stock, which is higher weight than unavailable. And so then we can actually look at daily active users that are actually seeing stuff that is available. So we talked about adoption and engagement quite a bit, but one of the most important metrics is actually retention, because you don't want to focus on adoption and engagement too much if you have a leaky boat, which means you have a lot of developers signing up, but they're leaving your platform because they can't solve the use case or they're having issues. And one of the ways to do this is to plot out product retention. What I'm showing here is two retention curves, one that's showing enterprise, one that's showing self-service. And for each week, we're shown these weekly different cohorts. So in week 0, these are developers that they signed up and are they using in the week. And of course, it's expected everyone's going to be at 100% the week they signed up. But each week later, you're going to see a percentage of those customers are actually dropping off. So for example, in week 1, at the enterprise level, we show that only 75% of those folks who signed up are still engaged with the platform, sending traffic or sending API calls. And on the self-service side, it drops down to 38%. Now, how do we measure a good retention curve? Well, one way to look at this is, does it level out? Sometimes folks will call this a smile curve. But we want to make sure that it doesn't go down to zero by the time we get to week 8, 9, and 10. Right? In this case, it does level out, which means we have a stable retention. And it's okay for us to continue to invest into things like adoption, growing sales, marketing, and so forth. Lastly, scaling self-service is hard, right? So we talked a lot about self-service. How do you get the right metrics, especially as you think about productizing your APIs? But you're going to have issues with onboarding, changing business needs, different billing surprises. And one of the best ways to do this is provide your customers with the same analytics observability that you have, right? So they don't have to ask, am I going to go over my quota? Am I going to get this $10,000 bill that I don't know what to do with? So by providing them the same metrics, you're able to do two things. One, provide transparency to your customers, but two, you're actually reducing the load on your support team, your account management team, to make sure, if it's something they can do themselves, they can, right? And so by providing those tooling, whether it's through in-app dashboards, sending out emails is another example. So when they do have a spike in usage, they're aware of it. There's a lot of different touch points around APIs. There's a touch point around the integration process. Are they getting 400 errors? Are they all 200s? Let them know about that. Hey, it looks like you have a bunch of 400 errors on the integration. You might want to take a look at this. Here's a doc link, or set up a call with the team to get you on the right path. Or in this case, I'm showing a quota email. It looks like you're over your quota. And you can decide how to handle that. Is it an overage fee? Is it the person is blocked? There's a lot of different strategies, but as long as you're informing your developers, they're not going to be surprised. Lastly, I did want to just quick plug, of course, since we're talking about Tyke here. If you are looking for observability and monetization, we do have an integration with Tyke, and always happy to help. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much. There was so much to learn over there. And I think for folks who want to have questions, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A section to ask anything that specifically comes to mind. I do have a couple of things that I want to ask. I mean, you've spoken about this entire journey and sort of looking at data at different levels and different layers. What kind of tools would you sort of recommend for something like this? What kind of tools would sort of be able to combine all of this data together, sort of, instead of, do you see one tool potentially enabling and capturing all of this information and presenting it as a dashboard to all parts of the business, or do you prefer having separate tools to meet separate specific requirements? What tools would enable this?
What I usually recommend is a small number of tools, because you're never going to find one tool for every use case, right? That one tool, for example, the business teams are not going to want to use engineering team tools. Engineering team and DevOps don't want to use business team tools, and vice versa. So if you try and go down the path of, say, every single person at the company has to use the same tool, it's going to run into disaster. And so you can't get the right data anyways. However, you don't want tool explosion. You don't want 20 different tools, and each team has like 5 people, so only have this little tiny tool. So what I usually recommend is, maybe a couple, 2 or 3 core tools that drive the business. You might have one that focuses on SRE and DevOps and all of those type of metrics that are needed for that team. It's still one tool for that team versus 10 tools for the same team. But then when you go to product and business, they are likely going to have a different tool that's mostly focused on looking at product metrics, business metrics, don't really care about more of the infrastructure stuff. But again, that team has 1, maybe 2 tools maxed, and then you can tie those usually together. So when you're looking at different tooling, do they have the integrations so you can tie everything together? Does it have a connector for segment? Does it have a connector to if you have an in-house data warehouse like Redshift or Snowflake? Can it actually integrate with stuff like Snowflake or Redshift? Are you running Google Ads? Does it connect with, say, Google Analytics and the Google Ads network? So ensuring that you have the right integrations, that saves a lot of time from building out a lot of manual ETL and pipeline work.
Yeah, that's super helpful. There's a question from Bill over here in the Q&A section, which is about, what do you see as first steps when starting the journey from internal-only APIs to new APIs that would be used by external partners?
Sure, definitely. And it's definitely a journey. It's not like you go from 0 to 1 in a week. The first step, of course, is just understanding how will people adopt the APIs, right? And what are the use cases? And there's two different schools of thought here. A lot of folks will like the relationship-based approach where it's more of a closed ecosystem. You do have a way to request access to APIs, but it's more of a high-touch sales process. And there's, of course, the other approach, which is, you fully open your platform and you can sign up and they just put down their credit card. And there's, of course, a lot of ways you can do this in between. But understanding from a customer standpoint, how do they typically like to engage, right? Are they very hands-off? Do they require a lot of high-touch points in order to be successful? The second thing to look at is getting some type of analytics in place to then start understand that usage, because it's very hard to figure out things like pricing and packaging. We don't have even any analytics for what are the right tiers. And what I like to do is get the analytics in place so you can see, even if the people are just using it for free or you're leaving money on the table for the first period of time, at least see, okay, I have this cluster of developers and customers that are in this range using this use case. I have this cluster that is in this range in this use case. And then that allows you to start building a strategy. Okay, is my strategy going to be prepaid with a credit-based approach? Is it going to be postpaid and I invoice the customers? And this is how the cadence of invoicing. So there's a lot of different ways you can take making an API public, but there's a lot of it is trying to figure out the right strategy, and you do the strategy decision making through the data that you have.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Bill. For the question, and Derric for the answer. I have one other thing. I think you showed the different journeys that usually folks take from adoption to engagement to retention. And there's always this notion of drop-offs. They are almost inevitable at some point of time. Some point within the journey, there will be drop-offs. So how do you sort of, from a mindset perspective, how do you sort of view drop-offs? What is sort of an acceptable rate for when it comes to drop-offs at these different levels? And what could be a possible strategy to re-engage? Do you re-engage is a question first? And then if so, what is an effective strategy to sort of re-engage at different levels?
Yes, there's definitely a good way to re-engage. And an important piece here is how do you re-engage? It's important to understand who the person is. Is it a developer at a large enterprise organization? Is it a developer that's in school? Because you're going to have a lot of different folks that are signing up to use the API for different use cases. And each one of those might have a slightly different path they take. For example, for the developer, he's an engineering manager at some large enterprise. Maybe it requires some deeper engagement because there's a lot more involved from a procurement standpoint than allowing a developer that's just at a small startup. They want to explore on their own time. And so you might decide, well, these developers are going to have an automated email. These developers might have a manual outreach, and you can create those type of lists, whether it's a tool of MOSA, external observability tool, create a list of these are the folks that stop sending traffic, and I should start reaching out to them. So you can set up like a Slack message for those teams. Now, there's a right and a wrong way to reach out. And the thing we have to be very careful about is developers do not necessarily respond, right? A lot of developers want to be left alone. And so allowing it to be a very passive engagement model is a key thing. So sharing a documentation link, a guide, a video, things that they can consume asynchronously without always just trying to set up a meeting. And so if you just always check in and say, hey, how are things going? Do you want to get on a sales call? It can be the worst thing from a developer experience perspective, but instead saying, hey, saw you were running into issues. Here's a guy that might help you. That might be a better approach when you engage with developers. Now, speaking of the drop-off itself, there's of course healthy and unhealthy drop-off. You're always going to have drop-off. There's never going to be a case where every single sign-up converts into a paying customer at 100%. The way I look at it is, what are the typical drop-off rates? But then also applying the right filtering criteria to each of those stages. And a good example is to have the right qualification criteria. So let's say you have a bunch of developers signing up with a Gmail. Well, it could mean one of two things. It could mean, one, they're not serious, and maybe it just happens to be a student that's exploring, but they're not necessarily ready to buy, which is perfectly fine. And maybe you just want to leave them alone. But you could also have another set of developers. They actually work at a large organization. they're actually exploring, a new API to purchase for a larger initiative that is going on at the company, but they happen to sign up through Gmail because, well, you maybe have GitHub as a login option, and they just happen to use GitHub. So having the right enrichment data to know who this person is, so then again, you can segment and actually create the right cohorts of developers, so you have the right outreach strategy. When you apply those criteria to your activation funnel, then you actually have a better visibility as well. So for example, let's say you have a very healthy, about 40 or 50% of the folks who sign up end up using the API, either at least through Postman, sending 1 or 2 API calls. Okay, they were at least, looks like you have the right audience signing up. They're developers. They're at least able to use Postman. They can send the first API call. That's a good, level right there. But let's say now we further apply, okay, what if it's only developers that work at a company of 1,000 employees and more? And that drop off goes down to 10%. That means there's an issue, but it's hidden because you're just looking at the overall metrics and you're not segmenting those different activation funnels in the right way.
Got it. Well, thank you so much. We are at time at this point. So thank you. This has been an amazing discussion already. There's a lot of good takeaways from it. So once again, thank you very much. Over to our very next session, folks, on the decision makers track, we're going to be exploring 200 is not always okay. And on the implementers track, we'll be exploring leveraging the RED method for streamlined root cause analysis with OTel, Tempo, Pyroscope, and Grafana. So over to the next session. Thank you so much, Derric. Thank you, everyone, for joining. See you in the next one.
Thanks, everyone.